Hello everyone and welcome back to our reading of Atlantis. Today's chapter, Plato's Lost Continent. Atlantis, a wondrous and legendary island, is often referred to as the Lost Continent. It has intrigued people around the world for centuries. More than 2,300 years ago, Plato, the Greek philosopher, wrote the oldest known description of Atlantis. Plato lived from about 428 BC to 348 BC in Athens, Greece. About 360 BC, very late in his life, he created two works that are the source of much of our basic information about this fascinating place. These works, Timaeus and Critias, are two of Plato's dialogues, philosophical works, in which he has two or more characters discussing ideas. Plato and his contemporaries viewed the world's geography differently than we do today. To them, the known world was an island made up of Europe, the Near East, and North Africa. In the center of this island was a large lake, the Mediterranean Sea. The island was surrounded by Oceanus, or ocean. A huge continent surrounded the ocean. The ocean and the outer continent were largely unexplored mysteries at this time and for centuries to come. Plato spoke of Atlantis as a large island situated in the mysterious ocean to the west of the known world, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Atlantis in the Timaeus dialogue. In the Timaeus dialogue, Plato's character Critias begins the story of Atlantis. He states that the tale comes from his ancestor Solon, to whom it was told by Egyptian priests when he visited Egypt generations before in about 600 BC. Solon in turn told it to his brother Dropidas, who passed the story down to his descendants. Scholars believe that the story's narrator Critias was Dropidas's great-grandson. They disagree, however, about Plato's relationship to Critias. Critias may have been his great-grandfather or his maternal uncle. Mention of the name Solon no doubt lent some credibility to the story of Atlantis. Solon was a leading lawgiver in Athens, Greece, 150 years before Plato lived. It is generally accepted by historians that Solon did visit Egypt, and, considering the circumstances of the period, it is likely that he exchanged ideas with the Egyptian priests. Plato, through his narrator Critias, stresses at the very beginning that this was, on the authority of Solon, to be not a mere legend but an actual fact. This statement sums up the dispute about Atlantis. Is the story of Atlantis fiction, or is it an oral history based on actual events? Critias reports that the Egyptian priests told Solon a tale about events that took place 9,000 years before, or about 9600 BC. There was a time before the Great Destruction, when Athens was a leader in military power and well-governed too. But there was a mighty power which, unprovoked, invaded all of Europe and Asia. Your great city Athens defeated this power. This mighty power came from an island in the Atlantic Ocean, in the days when that ocean was still navigable. The island, Atlantis, was just across from the Pillars of Hercules. It was larger than the combined sizes of Libya and Asia. From it, ships could travel to other islands, and even to the great continent that surrounds the ocean. For the sea that lies within the pillars, the Mediterranean, is only a harbour with a narrow entrance. Beyond it is the great ocean and the surrounding land, a mighty continent. Now on this island of Atlantis, there was a powerful government that ruled this island, many others, and even parts of the continent. The army of Atlantis had conquered Libya as far as Egypt and Europe, as far as central Italy. But it was not satisfied. It tried to conquer Greece, Egypt, and all the territory within the straits. Greece shone in virtue and in strength. She stood alone when the others deserted her. She defeated the invaders and saved many from slavery. Generously, she freed all who lived within the Pillars of Hercules. But afterwards, there were violent earthquakes and floods. In one day and one night, all of your troops disappeared into the sea. In the same manner, Atlantis also disappeared into the depths of the ocean. Because of this, the sea in that place can no longer be navigated. It is blocked by mud shallows, which the island produced when it sank. Is this story a fable? Plato is not known as a storyteller, so why would he invent such a tale? Yet, how can it be based on fact? Historians say that the advanced cultures described here could not have existed before 3000 to 4000 BC. Atlantis in the Critias dialogue. The dialogue of Critias continues the story about ancient Athens. Then he moves on to a complete description of the foe, Atlantis. He reminds his listeners that he had heard this story when he was a child. It had been handed down within the family from Solon himself. Critias reported that the ancient gods divided upon the earth into sections of different sizes. They made temples and sacrifices for themselves, and Poseidon, god of the sea, received as his share the island of Atlantis. In the center of the island, but looking toward the sea, there was a beautiful and fertile plain. A primitive people lived in this island. Near the plain, and also in the center of the island, there was a mountain where a young woman named Plato lived. Poseidon fell in love with this mortal woman. He enclosed the island on which she lived by making alternate rings of earth and water around it. He made 2 rings of land and 3 of water. He brought warm and cold springs of water to the island. He also made every kind of food grow abundantly. Plato and Poseidon had 5 pairs of male children, and they divided the island into 10 parts. Poseidon gave to Atlas, the firstborn of the eldest pair, Clyto's dwelling and the surrounding land. This was the largest and the best portion. He also made Atlas the king over all the rest. Both Atlantis and the Atlantic Ocean were named after him. Each of the other sons also received a portion of the island, and were made lesser kings or princes. These sons and their descendants ruled and populated many outlying islands as well. The Empire. Down through the generations, Critias stated the rulers of Atlantis had more wealth than any king had ever had, or is likely to have. Goods were brought to the rulers from all over the world. Animals, flowers, fruits, and vegetables thrived in this land. In fact, the island itself provided everything that was needed, including orichalcum in abundance. Orichalcum was apparently a metal more precious than gold that was no longer known even by Plato's time. Atlantis' rulers built temples, palaces, harbors, and docks. They built a special palace in the same location Poseidon and their ancestors had lived. Each king added to this palace, making it more magnificent than the king before him, until it was a marvel to behold for size and beauty. The rulers dug a canal from the inner harbor to the outer harbor and then to the sea. The canal was 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and about 6 miles long. Even the largest vessel could navigate from the sea to the outer harbor. Walls were built around each of the land zones. The outermost wall was covered with brass, the next with tin. The third, which surrounded the inner island, was of orichalcum. Poseidon's Temple. In the center of the island was a temple dedicated to Plato and Poseidon. This temple, which was 600 feet long and 30 feet wide, was surrounded by a wall of gold. Yearly, the citizens in each of the 10 regions brought the fruits of their lands here as an offering. All of the temple exterior, except the peaks of the roof, was covered with silver. The peaks were covered with gold. Inside, the temple ceiling was carved ivory. Silver, gold, and orichalcum adorned everything. The walls, pillars, and floor were covered with orichalcum. Gold statues of the 10 kings and their wives were placed throughout, but the grandest gold statue was of Poseidon himself. He drove a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses. His head reached almost to the ceiling. He was surrounded by 100 nereids, riding dolphins. There was also a great altar, magnificent in size and workmanship. Palaces and springs. The individual palaces were as splendid as the temple, Critias reported. There were abundant fountains with hot and cold springs. There were baths built for the king and baths for private citizens. There were even baths for the horses and cattle. Some of the water ran off to the grove of Poseidon, where all kinds of beautiful trees grew in its rich soil. On the rings of land, there were gardens, temples, gymnasiums, and areas for horses to exercise. On the large outer ring, known as the Major Zone, there was a racetrack that extended around the island. On each of the 3 rings of land, there was a guardhouse. The most trusted guards lived on the island itself. They guarded the king. Military supplies ready for use filled the harbors and docks. The harbor. Enclosing the entire ringed complex was another wall about 6 miles from the outermost harbor. This densely populated outer area was the business district. The canal between the sea and the outermost harbor was full of ships. Merchants came from all parts of the world. The sound of human voices and the noise of trading went on day and night. The plain. To the north, beyond the great outer wall of the outer city, was an oblong plain. This flat land was surrounded by mountains that descended into the sea. The plain extended about 3,000 stadia in one direction and 2,000 stadia in the other. A stadium is about 606 feet, so the plain was about 360 miles by 240 miles. A great circular ditch surrounded the plain, and it caught the water from the mountain streams. The water flowed to the city and then to the sea through the canals. Smaller canals cut into the plain, and the water flowed to the great canal surrounding the plain. With this network of waterways, the wood and fruit of the island were transported easily to the city. The rulers. Critias stated that each of the 10 kings ruled his own division and in his own city had the absolute control of the citizens, and in most cases of the laws, punishing and slaying whomsoever he would. But the laws of Poseidon governed the king's relationships with each other. These laws were inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum in the temple of Poseidon. They required the kings to meet after 5 years, then after 6 years, then after 5 years again. Thus, they gave honor to the odd and even years. They gathered to discuss public affairs and pass judgment on any possible violations of the law, but first they held a religious ritual. The sacrifice. According to Critias, bones roamed freely through the temple. The 10 kings, without weapons, but with staves and nooses, hunted the bones. When a bone was caught, it was sacrificed so that its blood spilled over the pillar inscribed with the laws. Then the kings prayed and swore to obey Poseidon's laws, and to punish anyone who had violated them. When darkness came and the sacrificial fire was cool, the kings put on beautiful blue robes. While sitting on the ground near the embers, they judged any case brought before them. At daybreak, they wrote down their sentences on a golden tablet and put it away with their robes. Laws. There were many special laws. Among the most important were those that required loyalty. They must not fight one another, and all must come to the rescue if anyone attempted to overthrow the royal house. They must deliberate together about war and other matters. And finally, the king did not have the power of life and death over any of his kinsmen, unless the majority of the 10 kings agreed. For many generations, said Critias, the people of Atlantis remained obedient to Poseidon's laws. As his descendants, they continued to worship him. They practiced gentleness and wisdom in life and in their interactions with each other. They despised everything but virtue, and thought that possession of gold and other property was a burden rather than a benefit. They were wise and saw clearly that goodness was increased by virtuous friendship with one another. But eventually, the people forgot their divine ancestry. Human nature got the upper hand. The people grew more interested in amassing wealth than in maintaining their virtue. Critias reported that Zeus, the ruler of the gods, saw this deterioration of the Atlanteans. He decided to punish them so that they would see the error of their ways and change. Critias said that Zeus called all the gods together and spoke. But here, Critias's account ended abruptly. We don't know what Zeus said to the gods. Plato left the story hanging. Did he intend to finish the dialogue? Did he simply lose interest? Or was the end of this dialogue lost? We don't know. Nevertheless, we learned many details of the appearance of the lost continent. The ancient response to Plato. The controversy about Atlantis seems to have begun soon after Plato's accounts appeared. Plato's most famous student, Aristotle, is reported to have denied the existence of Atlantis. He said Plato made up the island, and then made up an earthquake and a flood to destroy his invention. Grantor, a scholar who lived about 335 to 275 BC, accepted Plato's accounts as historical fact. He did not question Plato's descriptions. Diodorus Siculus, in about 30 BC, wrote that a highly civilized Atlantis was the birthplace of the gods. Pliny the Elder, writing about 77 BC, mentioned a large land area being destroyed, where the Atlantic Ocean is now, if we believe Plato. Philo Judaeus wrote about a land, such as the island of Atlantis, being swallowed up by the sea. Ignatius Donnelly's Search for Atlantis. Atlantis appeared over and over in writings throughout the centuries. Many centuries after Plato, the voyages of Columbus and other explorers raised new speculations about Atlantis. Was America the lost continent Plato wrote about? It was in the late 1800s that Atlantis once again seriously captured people's imaginations. In 1882, Ignatius Donnelly, a former congressman from Minnesota, published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Before Donnelly, most works about Atlantis seems to have been based on Plato's accounts, but Donnelly's new work quickly became the foundation for most pro-Atlantean writings. Even today, Donnelly's work is influential. He set out to prove these points. Plato's description is history, not fable. Atlantis was the place where civilization first developed. Atlantis became a mighty nation, and its people also populated the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi River, the west coast of Europe and Africa, the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Caspian Sea. Atlantis was the original Garden of Eden, where people lived in peace and harmony. Egypt was Atlantis's oldest colony. Atlantis was swallowed by the ocean, and nearly all its inhabitants perished. A few survivors escaped to the east and west. Their stories are the basis for the flood stories found in the Old Testament, among Native American legends, and in other traditions all over the world. Critics such as Ellen Sprague de Camp dismissed Donnelly as a pseudoscientist or false scientist, but Donnelly's work ignited interest in Atlantis. Scientists, geographers, explorers, linguists, and occultists continued the debate. The debate goes on. Geochemist Cesar Emiliani and others have suggested that a sudden rise in sea level caused by glacial melting about 11,600 years ago could have flooded Atlantis. But modern geological theory says that it is not possible for a body of land the size Plato described to have existed in the Atlantic within the past 12,000 years, and certainly it could not have disappeared without a trace in a day and a night. Most historians say that the Athens and Atlantis that Plato described could not have existed in 9000 BC. Human civilization at that time was still in the Paleolithic period. That is, people were still living in caves and hunting for their food. How could such an advanced and organized civilization as that described by Plato have coexisted with cave people? To us, history began with the invention of writing and written records. Everything that happened before the beginnings of writing in about 35,000 BC is called prehistory because there are no records of the time. Our knowledge about prehistory is mostly theory pieced together from discoveries of ancient bones and artifacts, such as pottery, tombs, and ruins found here and there around the world. But prehistory is a jigsaw puzzle, with most of the pieces missing. We can only guess what the picture looks like and how the few pieces we have fit. And sometimes we may even try to force a few pieces together out of frustration. Writers and scientists continue to speculate about what the world looked like in ancient times. Is it possible that long before our own existed, there was another sophisticated civilization, like that described by Plato, whose records were lost or destroyed? Yes, well, that's quite the question to end on, isn't it? Anyway, I'll see you next time. See ya!